Okay, welcome back to Introduction to Sociology, your summer class lecture. Today, we are going to be discussing social class. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about social class. So we've done kind of an introduction into sociology and what it is and kind of provided a pretty good foundation. And so now we're going to kind of introduce the three main, what oftentimes we call the sociological triad: race, class, and gender, and kind of break each of those down in terms of our identity. Those are the three major social identities that we all kind of inhabit or adopt. All of us are organized into either a race, a class, or a gender. And then within that, you have things like, race kind of dictates space, whether you live in an urban area or a rural area. Sometimes those things kind of go hand in hand. Depending on the state you live in or the city. And then gender, we typically, talk about that in tandem with sexuality. So sexuality also is a part of that as well. It's, if somebody wants to put it separately, they can, or if oftentimes we talk about gender and sexuality together, but race, gender, and class, with sexuality being a part of that gendered kind of conversation, is for the most part our identities. Although we have other social identities like religion, like language, educational status, all these other things that make up who we are. Those are like the main three that we generally talk about in sociology. So we've talked about white privilege, male privilege. We've talked about the race, gender, privilege situation, and now we're going to go deep into social class. And then later on, we're going to talk about race and, go provide a little bit more background into race, and then provide a little bit more background in terms of gender. And then we're going to go from there. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. You should have read the reading that was assigned to you in your syllabus. And so we're just gonna go deeper into social class. All right. So let's get into it. On the first slide, we talk about social stratification. And so the reason why I think this is necessary when we're talking about social class is that the first thing we have to understand is that in our society, our society is what we call the stratified society, meaning that within our society, whether you're talking about race or class or gender or sexuality, there is a ranking that we place people, right? We first put people into categories, which isn't necessarily a negative thing, right? To put people into categories. So within our society, there are people who are considered poor. There are people who are considered working class, people who are considered, whatever, right? Rich. We place people into categories. That is what we call social class, or with the ones that I just described will be our class categories. In terms of race, there are certain categories. You have white, you have Black, you have Asian, you have Latinx, you have different categories for race. You have different categories for gender. You have male, you have female, you have non-binary. You have different categories for sexuality: heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, pansexual. Also with gender, you have transgender, right? So you have all these different categories. But the thing that makes stratification important is that within the categories, there are hierarchies. So that means one group is higher or lower than another group, right? And so it's not just about putting people in categories. The issue with the stratified society is that after we put the people into categories, now we place value on each of those categories. And that value, that assigned value, then dictates life experiences, life chances, and opportunities, right? That's the issue with stratification. And so within a social class, we may say, well, you're poor, and that's your category. And if that's your category, then okay. But now, because you're poor, you are at the bottom. Because you're rich, you are at the top. So now there is a hierarchy. If we're talking about race, then we may say, well, because you're white, you're at the top, you have these opportunities, you have these experiences. And if you're Black, you're at the bottom, you have these opportunities, you have these experiences, and then everything in between. So again, stratification is not just being put into certain categories, but it is also the hierarchies that are attached to these categories and the value that is attached to people in those categories. And so the four main components that help to dictate a social strata, right? So the category that you fall in is called a strata. Is number one, individual differences, right? What individual differences exist with you and another person, right? If you are a person who is middle class, then what are the individual differences between the middle class person and an upper class person, right? So you have those individual differences. You have generationally traditional. So there are these traditional ideas or traditional norms that exist within people in your particular strata. What are the beliefs of people that exist within your category? What kind of philosophies do they live by? And then how does society handle the differences between the people within those stratified categories? Okay, these are the things that help dictate the categories and the hierarchies that exist within a socially stratified society. Okay. And so social class is one of those stratified identities, right? In fact, I would probably argue that it is the oldest before there was a such thing as race, right? Before there were, in fact, race is a fairly new concept. Definitely in the past maybe 500 years. And ethnicity has been a thing for a while, but even before ethnicity, you still had people that were poor, middle class, you know, and rich. And so, again, and then even before gender, right? We always knew that there were, you know, there were differences between men and women biologically, in terms of the traditional way of understanding male and female men and women. But in terms of the descriptions that we have assigned, the characteristics that we have assigned to men and women, that has developed over time. You would have to talk to a gendered scholar, but I would argue that class is probably just as old, if not older, than the gender dynamics that we have assigned to the biological categories of male and female, right? So social class is social stratification is very important when we're discussing social class. So when we talk about social class, generally social class is measured by three main things: occupation, income, and wealth, right? So as a person who is a class scholar, as a person who studies social class, I understand that, and I would even argue that social class is one of the most difficult identities to measure, right? It's when you're studying race, it can be simple. Not to say knowing everybody's race is simple. And if we were in class, if we were in class physically together, I would play a game with you to help you all, to test that. There's this activity that I do. But even so, yeah, so you can come across people and not know their race. That's very true. So not to say that you can see somebody's skin color or hair texture or whatever and automatically know their race, but you can measure race oftentimes based on their subjective identity. Somebody will tell you what their race is. Somebody will say, well, my mom is this, my dad is this, my mother, my father, and so there is this kind of subjective identity. Also, we understand within society that people who are of a certain race, there are kind of traditions, particularly within the US context, that exist based on what we know about history, based on what we see right now in the media and popular culture. There are certain histories, ideas, cultures related to racial categories. Gender can also be measured, again, based on a sexual category, based on somebody's subjective identity. Obviously, there is no way for you to look at somebody and tell what their subjective identity is. You can look at a person and they may look like a male or they may look like a female. But then if you ask them, they may say, I'm non-binary, or they may say, I'm transgender, or they may say, well, I'm male presenting, but I'm female identifying. So you don't know unless you talk to them, right? But generally they may, especially now that there's language around this, people will oftentimes tell you how they identify or who they are. Now, with social class, that's a bit different. And this is because I study it, so I know oftentimes when you ask somebody, what is your social class? Most people don't really know. They'll say, well, how are we defining it? Like, is it like a certain amount of money? Do I have to make more than this or less than that? And that's part of it, right? But it also depends on how many people live in your house, because you can make $100,000 a year, or your household income can be $100,000 a year. But if there's 9 people living there and several people within that house help to contribute to $100,000 a year in a 9-income household or a 9-person household, that's probably not middle class. If by yourself, and then depending on where you live too, but if by yourself you make $100,000, yeah, that's middle class, right? If you're living in Florida, right? Then yeah, that would be considered middle class, or 2 people even. That would be considered middle class, right? So it's not just about money, it's also about household income. And most people will say, oh, well, yeah, I think I'm middle class. And I have interviewed people who thought that they were working class, but they were really middle class, or thought that they were middle class and they were really working class, or felt that they were middle class because they had so many bills, even though they were really upper middle class. So a lot of people don't really know their social class identity because there's so many things that go into it. There's so many things that go into how you would identify. And then also, if you look at various authors and scholars that have presented on social class, you find that a lot of them do it differently. They define it differently. Some people use residence, or if you own a home, as part of your social class identification. Some don't. I don't, but some do, right? But the 3 that are the most universal when you're talking about social class definitions is occupation, income, and education, right? Occupation, income, and wealth. And then education is also one, particularly among Black people. But there's a unique history around why education is involved. But a lot of times with white people, because education is something that has already been, that was a given for white people, particularly within the US context. That's something that has always been available to white people, as long as it's been available to, in general. There was a time only middle class or rich people got an education, but I would say at least in the past, maybe about 200 years, it's been pretty available to a lot to a lot of white people. But for Black people, education is and especially higher education is fairly new in comparison to white folks, and then people of other racial groups as well. So with Black people, education is also an important indicator of social class among Black people. But in general, when we study social class, occupation, income, and wealth are the three main indicators. And so occupation means if you have a blue collar job versus if you have a white collar job, right? Or professional job. Do you have a job that requires a certain physical skill set versus a certain knowledge base? Do you have a job that requires you to create, being a part of the creative class? That's another kind of part of the storyline in terms of, or the scholarship in terms of social class. So if a person has a blue collar job, they may be considered working class. If a person has a white collar job, that may be considered a middle class job. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that the person with the blue collar job makes less money. That's why class is not just about money, it's also about perception. How does society view you? Because you can be an HVAC worker, you can install air conditions in homes and get paid a lot of money to do that. You can make six figures doing that, right? But that may be considered a blue collar job. And you can be a teacher, on a pre-K teacher, and get paid $35,000, $37,000. That's unfortunate, but it's true. All right. So, but a teacher has to go to school, has to get a bachelor's, oftentimes even a master's. And an HVAC worker doesn't necessarily have to do that. They have to go to school, but they may not have to go to college, right? So again, but society still looks at these things as the teacher is a middle class, maybe considered a middle class occupation. It's a white collar occupation, and an HVAC worker may be considered a blue collar job. Then you do have income. Income is a part of social class. So depending on where you live, depending on how much you make, depending on how many people live in your house, if you make quite a bit of money or your household brings in quite a bit of money, so not just you, but if it's a husband and a wife, a spouse and a spouse, and they together bring a certain amount of money into the house, then that determines what your class is. So for example, I remember somebody who I interviewed for my research. It was a same-sex couple, and the husband that worked made a lot of money. The husband that did not work was a house husband, but the husband that did not work would still be considered middle class. Why? Because the husband that does not work still has access to the money that his husband brought in, still had access and was able to live a lifestyle, a middle-class lifestyle, largely because of his husband's salary, right? So he would be still considered middle class. Now, if they were to divorce and he lived separately, then he may be considered working class, poor working class or whatever. But together, they will be considered middle class, both of them, right? So income, depending on household, depending on how many people live in the house, depending on all these different things, definitely plays a role in class status. Then also depends on where you live, right? Depends on where you live. So if you live in New York and you make $50,000 or $60,000 a year, that may not be a lot. You may still be considered working class. If you live in New York, if you live in Alabama and you make $60,000 a year, that's good, right? Because the cost of living is higher in New York or Los Angeles or Chicago than it would be in Birmingham, Alabama, or Little Rock, Arkansas, or Salt Lake City, Utah, right? So just depends. And then wealth. Wealth plays a role because, uh, sometimes you can have high or low income, but high wealth, right? There are people who come from very rich families. So if you ask them what is their income, they may say zero. I don't do anything. But their father or grandfather or mother or grandmother is the inherited millions and millions and millions of dollars from their father or mother or grandfather or grandmother based on work that they did or their business or whatever. They may be living off trust fund money. So it just depends, right? It just depends. Yeah, so wealth is important. Some people live off of money because maybe their grandparents or great grandparents own a lot of property. And so because they own a lot of property and people rent their buildings or they just have money coming in and they don't have to do anything. And the money is just constantly coming in. So wealth is important as well because you can have no occupation, no income, and still be extremely wealthy. So you can still fit within a certain class status. So social class is very difficult to define. There's a lot of factors involved, as you can tell. Now, a lot of times when we talk about class, it is important for us to talk about both caste and class. What is the difference between caste and class? Can anybody tell me? Or can you think about it? Obviously, you can't tell me, but think about what is the difference between caste and class. So caste is a stratified, if you live in a caste system, you live in a system that is stratified along economic lines with no opportunity of moving between within or moving in and out of that particular strata. Okay? There's no opportunity for that. Meaning, if you were born poor, the likelihood of you becoming rich or even middle class is slim to none. There's a slim chance that you'll be able to do that. If you're rich, the opportunities that are provided for you in the caste system will make it difficult for you to not be rich anymore, unless you just try really hard. So in the caste system, whatever you're born into, that's who you are. That's what you are. And it's difficult to climb out of that. Within a class system, you may be born into a certain category, but based on the laws of meritocracy, which means if you work hard, based on your merit, you have the opportunities to move from being poor to working class and working class to middle class and middle class to upper middle class. So the society that you live in gives you those opportunities to achieve success if you would like to, if you work hard. So with caste, the caste has lower mobility, but higher status consistency, which means you won't be able to be mobile between caste groups, but your caste group is consistent. If your mother was an untouchable, you would be an untouchable, your kids would be an untouchable. It's consistent. In a class system, you have higher mobility, which means you can move in and out of those class categories, and the consistency is supposed to be lower, meaning you might be poor, or your parents might be poor, but they work hard, and then you might be middle class, and then you work hard, and then your kids might be rich. So that's how it's supposed to work in a class system. There are books that suggest, or historically, there is this suggestion that the United States functions as a class society. However, there are arguments that say that that's not the case, that the United States functions more as a caste system than a class system, meaning that the United States, while it boasts a class society, a land of opportunity for everyone, where everybody has the opportunity to come to this country and be successful. The reality is that's not always the case. The reality is that it is actually very difficult to move up from one class to another class. In fact, historically, especially for people of color, or not all people of color, but particularly for Black and Latinx people, it is extremely difficult, depending on how low income you are. Because there are all of these other factors that make it difficult for you or people in your family to move up. Whether you're talking about increased cost of living, whether you're talking about criminal justice reform or the need for criminal justice reform, whether you're talking about educational inequality, whether you're talking about income inequality, there are all of these barriers that make it very difficult for people to be able to move out of their present day class or caste situation. There's a whole book called Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. I don't know if I talked to you all about this. She wrote The Warmth of Other Suns, and she talked about the Great Migration. That was a big book in the 2000s. And then she recently came out with a book called Caste, where she talks about the United States as a caste society. Very, very powerful text. And is necessary when discussing this notion of, it makes an argument that the United States functions as a caste society, especially for people of color, particularly Black people, right? So caste and class is very important when we're talking about social class and the differences between the two. Another difference, what is the difference between income and wealth? So we talked about how occupation, income, and wealth are three parts of, or three ways to measure social class. But some people may say, well, what is the difference between income and wealth? I thought if you have high income, you're wealthy. So tell me, what's the difference? Income is the amount of money that you make at a given time, right? The amount of money you make at a given time, the amount of money you make, you work and then you get money for it. That's income. Okay? That's income. As opposed to wealth, wealth is generated over time. And wealth is generated based on the income that you put into a specific system that then provides you wealth out of that system. Wealth is generational. Wealth is passed down. Income is not passed down. You can work, make money, but you can't pass your income status down to your children. You can have a high income status, but based on what your children do, that will determine their income status. Your income status can be high, their income status can be low, or vice versa. But wealth is something that you can pass down. Wealth is something that is income that is generated over time. Wealth is something that exists outside of income. It is what you do with your income to make you more money. So wealth is typically generated within things like stocks, bonds, things that make money for you, property, housing, things that make money for you, businesses, investments, these things make money for you. And so that is the difference between income and wealth. Now, the highest indicator for wealth is income. You can't have high amounts of wealth without a large amount of income. You do need one to have the other. But then once you have a lot of wealth, then you don't need income because your income is coming from the wealth. So for example, let's take Oprah Winfrey. When Oprah Winfrey went from being a journalist in Baltimore to being a talk show host in Chicago, most people didn't bet on her. They said, well, this is 1984, 83. She's a Black woman. She's heavyset. Who's going to really watch this? Everybody's watching this white guy. Everybody's watching Donahue. Everybody's watching all these other people. I don't think nobody's going to watch this. So when she says, well, I want to own my show and I want to get the royalties, they say, okay, it's probably not going to last that long anyway. You can have it. But little did they know, right? It will stay on the air for 25 years. And she reaped the benefits of it by ensuring that she had ownership over her name and over her show. So after the income was going from the show, obviously she made a lot of money just hosting the show. But then the ownership and being able to make money off of the show by owning the show means that now that the Oprah Winfrey show is no longer in syndication. Well, it probably is in syndication somewhere. But although she does not have to go to work every day to go and host the show, she still makes money off of the show. She made the show a wealth generating opportunity for her. So now that she does not have to work, but she still makes money off of it. And then uses that money and puts it into the magazine and all these other places, right? So again, but you can't have that level of wealth, right? Which again, that's what makes Oprah Winfrey, a billionaire. But you can't have that level of wealth without first being able to make a lot of money off of hosting the show. So high income leads to high amounts of wealth. The class system emphasizes personal prestige, level of respect from neighbors, association networks, and socialization. And association is networks and socialization, the skills you learn within a specific class. So the class system emphasizes personal prestige. And what prestige is just the level of respect you have from your neighbors. That is also a part of class. So for example, you can be a professor, and a professor, being a professor ranges. You can make $40,000 being a professor. You can make $250,000, $500,000 being a professor. It just depends on your status, what you do, where you work, all these different things, right? So it depends. But the level of respect, the prestige that professors have doesn't necessarily change. Whether you're a $40,000 professor or a $500,000 professor or $1 million professor like Malcolm Hill, who also makes money off of books and stuff. But yeah, either way, if you go somewhere and they ask you what you do and you say you're a professor, there's a certain amount of respect that you'll get from your neighbors. That's called prestige, right? Then you also class, and so that may put you at a middle class status. Association. It's not just about the respect that you get from them, but also what kind of networks are you involved in? Who can you call to do a favor? Who can you call, or what type of groups or what type of rooms can you go in based on your class status, based on your occupation, based on your income, based on your wealth reputation? What kind of people can you talk to? How can these people influence society? And then socialization, the skills that you learn in a specific class. What are the skills that you learn as you navigate this class society? What do you learn as a poor person, as a working class person, as a middle class person? All right. What are some things that you're able to accomplish? And what are some ways in which you navigate life based on how you've experienced life as this poor, working class, middle class, upper middle class person? There are ways in which you learn how to get around the rules if you're poor, working class. There are also ways in which you learn how to get around the rules if you're upper class. Learn a lot of tax codes, ways to not cheat the system. You follow the law, but there's a lot of tax loopholes that rich people know that poor people more than likely don't know. So that's the socialization part. What are you learning within that class category? We talked about meritocracy, separation based on knowledge, abilities, and efforts. How do societies increase meritocracy? Meritocracy is this idea that you are successful based on your merit, based on your knowledge, based on your work. Power is the potential that somebody has over another person to carry out an agenda. In sociology, we call that hegemony, right? How much power do you have over people, even people that don't agree with you? The potential that you have to make people do something that they don't even agree with is power. Oklahoma passed a law that made abortions legal after a certain time. The Oklahoma state legislature. A lot of people disagree. But guess what? State legislature has power. That means it don't matter whether you agree or disagree. Within these boundaries, that is the law. And the people that live there have to live under that law. That's power. Now, the people have power because the people can now push back, resist, boycott, vote certain people out. So there's a certain level of power there. But that is what society oftentimes is. It's this battle of power. Class consciousness, the degree to which individuals are aware of their unique position, group, and shared interests. So how well do you understand your class consciousness? First, can you admit that you are a part of a certain class, of the poor class, the working class, the middle class, the upper middle class, whatever? And then to what degree do you understand your class consciousness, the benefits or the challenges that come with your position, and what are the shared interests between people within your class group? How well do you understand that? How well do you understand what it's like to be a middle class person and the privileges and challenges that come with that? And social mobility, the extent to which people can move up and down in the class category. So we talked about that. In classes, the level of social mobility is supposed to be a lot easier. In the caste society, not so much, right? So it's important for people to understand that, because then that then dictates their class consciousness. All right, so we spend a lot of time on that section. So let's go to the next chapter. Not next chapter. I was looking at something else. The next slide. Would it be better to live in a classless society? This is something I want you to think about. Do you think it'd be better to live in a classless society? Or do you think that we should live in a society that has classes? Is it better to just say, you know what? Everybody's on the same playing field. Everybody's on the same level. There are no classes. There are no opportunities that rich people have that poor people don't have, or poor people have rich people don't have. It's classless. Everybody has the same. What's the average? What does it take for everybody to be able to live comfortably in this country? Well, if we do if everything stays the same and there's no inflation, everybody can live comfortably off $85,000. Everybody makes $85,000, just magically, right? Everybody makes $85,000, no matter your job. Is that good? A lot of people say, no, I don't like that idea, especially if you're from the United States. Why? Because the United States historically has prided itself on giving opportunities to people with innovative ideas. If I have $1 million idea, Why does it have to be capped at $100,000? When I have the opportunity to make millions simply because of where I live. So the United States says that it is a land of opportunity. It is a place where people feel that they can come to become successful. And there is no limit to what they can do. Then some people may say, well, that's good because now everybody has the same opportunity. In a classless society, there'll be less crime because now you won't have a whole lot of poor people. If everybody could take care of their families, everybody could take care, and you're robbing somebody, it's rare that you're going to rob somebody that makes the same amount of money as you. If you're able to take care of your family and this person's able to take care of their family, then what's the point of me trying to steal from them? So some people may say it would be good to live in a classless society. It'll be less crime, less deaths, higher quality of life in a classless society. But in a classless society, I won't be able to live I have the optimal life that I want financially. And this is how we get to Russia versus the United States, communism versus capitalism. For a while, Russia saw how capitalism led to high levels of social stratification, increasing levels of poverty and inequality, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, in the United States and in Europe. Russia said, we're not living like this. And Russia decides to implement Marx's ideas around a more classless society, Marx's ideas of socialism and communism. And for a long time, it worked. Economically, again, it doesn't mean that some people didn't make more than others. And that's what a lot of times people think when they think of socialism. You're trying to take away the wealth. You're trying to take away people's money. You're trying to raise taxes and make rich people pay more so that they don't have as much money. No, people have more money than others in a communist society, in communist Russia and communist China. Very true. The difference is the inequality did not exist in an exorbitant amount. So you don't have somebody like an Elon Musk who literally makes more money than they could possibly spend in 10 lifetimes. And in a country that has extreme high levels of poverty. It just doesn't make sense to have all of that money exist within a few people. And all of these other people are struggling. That is not as likely in a communist society. So financially, it's not as economically unequal. And it did keep a lot of people feeling good. People were very, in communist Russia and communist China, depending on the era, people were happy. However, just because a person is not stratified financially and economically doesn't mean that there can't be other stratifications. And in communist Russia, I believe, although financially it was not as stratified, it was not as unequal, politically it was. The power that people had depended on certain groups. If you were part of certain groups, you were more likely to be able to pass laws. You were more likely to be able to move about in a much more free and liberated way than people who were part of other groups. So they weren't stratified along financial lines or economic lines, but they were stratified politically, which means there was large levels of inequality politically. A lot of people couldn't vote. A lot of people didn't have say in the laws. A lot of people were able to pass laws that only benefited the people that looked like that or were a part of their particular social group. Now, but on the flip side, the United States was different. large levels of economic inequality. Some of the largest in the world still. But politically, at least in comparison to that, to communist Russia, it was fairly equal. You can vote. It doesn't matter what your class status was. You can vote. You can participate in politics. You can protest. You can have your voice heard. You can create a platform and you can criticize your leaders. So much more equal than communist Russia politically. Way more unequal economically. And so one is really no better than the other. It just depends on how it functions. Depends on what it is you're looking for out of life. But there's inequality in both. Now you have China, who's done a really good job because they used to be heavily communist as well during the era of Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution of the 1950s and 60s. But now China has created much more of a mixed economy. Much more of a mixed economy. Where now they function as a communist society in some ways, but a capitalist society in other ways, which makes them key innovators while still maintaining certain traditions. There's certain ideas around land and land ownership, but they're still very much communist. But when it comes to mass production and trade, they're very much capitalists. And they've learned how to merge both philosophies and social systems together to make them arguably the richest nation in the world, definitely the richest nation of the world without a slavery background. The United States is still probably considered the richest country in the world, but a majority of that wealth came from enslaved labor. It started from enslaved labor. It started from this huge stain, this huge evil system that was created to jumpstart the wealth for the country. There's this nightmare in the history that the country can never escape from. And China doesn't necessarily have that. All right. Going back to prestige. So when we talked about prestige, when you think about prestige, what does that mean to you? When somebody says you have a high level of prestige, what does that mean? And we're going to talk about it in a second. But prestige, again, is a result of your social class. Your social class, class categories, class networks. And when we think about class categories, how many of them exist to you? How many do you think we have? Some people say we got 2, rich and poor. Some people say we have 3, poor, middle class, rich. Some people may say we have 6, upper middle class, lower middle, poor, working class, lower middle class, upper middle class, lower upper class, upper class. Some people say we have 9. Some people may go as far as say we have 16. Upper, lower, middle, upper, middle, lower, upper, middle, and all kinds of categories, right? There was a research study done of residents of Yankee City. I believe this is in New England somewhere, in the New England area of the United States. And After the study was done, scholars suggested, looked at this idea of prestige and how it affected life chances for people. And what they found was that prestige is wealth, income, and occupation, just like class. A person's reputation, a person's class status existed based on how wealthy they were, how much money they made, and what kind of job they had. But within that comes a certain culture, a behavior, a lifestyle that plays a role in why and how they are the way they are. So prestige plays more into the idea of socialization. What kind of skills, characteristics, cultures come with this status? For example, if you're a college student, yes, you can become a college student and you can be successful in college if you're smart. That's very true. Couldn't get to college if you didn't have some level of intelligence. So yes. But once you get to college, then you realize, wait a minute, it's not just about the intelligence. I just can't be smart. Being smart can get me good grades. But in order for me to be successful in college, I'm going to have to be able to do some other things as well. You have to know how to network. You have to know how to ask questions. You can't be too shy. You have to know how to talk to your professors. You have to know how to stand your ground. You have to know the culture of college. You also have to understand the importance of socializing and networking, being a part of certain groups, being a part of certain social groups, fraternities, sororities, you can go to college, get good grades, graduate, and not be able to get a job because you didn't get internships, because you didn't shadow someone, getting experience that comes from going to certain places, networking, opportunities. So there's a lifestyle and a culture and behavior patterns that exist for certain groups. If you are among the wealthy, it's not just about having money among the wealthy. You can have a lot of money, but if you don't know the rules, the culture of wealth, how you're supposed to sit, how you're supposed to talk to somebody, how you snooze, how you act at a dinner party, what you say, what you don't say. All of these things play into the lifestyle. Saying the right things, doing the right things, rubbing shoulders with the right person. All these things play a role in being successful. Having prestige. Prestige are those class socialization characteristics that are assigned to certain economic categories. The best sign of prestige, they say, is intimate clique interactions. So, for example, whose house would you be invited to for dinner? Or better yet, whose numbers are in your phone? Who can you call for a favor? Who wants to have you around? That's the sign of prestige. Not just how much money you make, not just where you work, but also who you have intimate interactions with is an example of prestige. Okay. So now let's look at these class categories that we talked about, right? Let's look at these on the next slide. So with various class categories, a lot of people, or when we talk about how many categories exist within social class, as I said earlier, some people may say there's only 2 or 6 or however many. In this class, right, it's different definitions, but in this class, we're going to say that there's 6, right? Lower, lower, upper, lower, lower, middle, lower, upper, upper. Okay. Although, again, you can make an argument for however many you want to. So the lower are generally people who are poor, really, really poor, looked at as being disrespected, people who can't make a living, oftentimes homeless or living from couch to couch, right? Very little to no income. Then you have upper lower class people. These are like solid, respectable people, maybe people who clean houses. For the most part, they stay out of trouble. They're working class, you know, not quite poverty, but one step away, right? Oftentimes you may consider these people working class. Then you have a lower middle class, right? So these people who are maybe like your school teachers, make a little money, you know, have a little bit of prestige, not a whole lot. Maybe people who work in like a foreman in some kind of industry. Typically they go to church, maybe small businessmen, maybe they run a barbershop or a hair salon, maybe some type of, you know, a little bit above blue collar work, or maybe a little bit of college needed, some sort of professional development there. But not really much, definitely much difference from lower middle class and poverty, but not really much difference between lower middle class and upper lower class, working class. Then you have like upper middle, right? This is where a lot of people are. A lot of people may be like between upper middle, lower middle. Business and professional, more than likely bachelor's degree, probably even a master's degree. You know, moderately successful, can live off a couple of checks without going into poverty, maybe have a 3 to 6 month safety net kind of window to pay their bills until they can get another job if they would ever lose it. You know, pretty okay, decent, right? Lineage is unimportant, right? You don't have to worry about lineage until maybe you get into the upper class. So it really doesn't matter what your mom did, what your dad did. That doesn't dictate much in terms of how your life is. They really didn't pass anything down, not large amounts of money, at least, maybe a life insurance policy or something like that, that maybe you can then use to invest in. If you make a really good investment, then sure, you can go up to upper class or lower upper class or something. But generally speaking, that's not the case, right? Now you have lower upper class. These are your rich people. Very, very rich people, new money, right? These are your celebrities. These are your CEOs, very, very rich people. Sometimes they may even be richer than the upper class. For example, LeBron James makes more than the Kennedys, right? Right? That would be lower upper class. But again, he's lower upper class because that's new money. He didn't come from money. He came from a working class, more poor working class background. And through sports, basketball, and business, he became successful. So he has more money than the Kennedys, than John F. Kennedy's son. But he wouldn't be considered upper class, because upper class is not just about money, but about power, about old family elite, right? Leonardo DiCaprio from his movies, Tom Hanks from his movies may make more than the Kennedys, but do they have power that the Kennedys have to sway elections, to sway legislation, to go in certain circles, to be respected and speak on a global level? Could they meet with the president of China and discuss foreign policy? The president of the United States, Joe Biden, a lot of celebrities make more than Joe Biden does. But, well, he may not even be upper class either, because there's not a family lineage. Now, somebody who may have a family lineage assigned to their name might be somebody like the Obamas, President Obama, Michelle Obama. They didn't come from rich families. President Obama came from a very middle class family, and Michelle Obama came from a more of a working class family. But together, they have reached these elite status in society, and depending on what their kids do and their children's children do, it may create a family lineage of wealth and power. But we don't know that yet, right? So all of these things, this is kind of how class is assigned and defined, and again, shows the difficulty and the nuances around class. So now let's look at this example, right, on this next slide. Let's look at this example. And let's look at all of these different people, and let's see what we may say their class status is. So this first person over here, Taylor Swift. What class status would we say she is in? And you can pause it and then unpause it. We might say she is maybe lower or up or lower upper, right? Maybe because she's come from new money. I don't think she comes from a family of wealthy singers or wealthy entertainers. Now, the person below her looks like they're a homeless person. They may be considered what? Poor. Person below him looks like a construction worker. Some people may say, oh, that might be upper lower. Or it could be lower middle. Or it could be upper middle if he owns a big construction company. What about this artist here painting? Looks like a very good painting, a drawing or something. But artists, especially street artists, they may be upper lower. They're not making a lot of money maybe at the time. Unless you're a well-known artist, then sure, you will be in the lower upper probably, or at least upper middle. What about this basketball player? Would they be upper, old family elite money? Probably not. Maybe lower upper, right? Or maybe even upper middle, right? Excuse me. All right. May make $1 million, especially if they're not a well-known basketball player. Maybe $1,800,000 every season. Then you have a doctor. Doctor, upper middle class, right? Good job, good money. Probably have a lot of student loans to pay back. Then you have Michelle Obama. Probably somewhere between family elite, working towards a family elite, and upper, lower upper. Probably there could probably be even a category in between there somewhere. All right. Then you have this mechanic. Some people may look at mechanics as, well, mechanics make pretty good money. They're very well needed. Especially if you work for a big company, Toyota, Honda, Tesla. But could definitely be lower class, or maybe lower middle. Maybe working to solidly a good solid middle class. This McDonald's worker, probably low, poor, or maybe upper lower, working class for sure. Maybe not poor, but working class. Kim Kardashian, somewhat maybe a family elite, definitely came from a very wealthy family. Father was a well-renowned lawyer in Hollywood. Kim Kardashian's dad was on the O.J. Simpson case in the 90s, part of the O.J. Simpson case, a big case in the 90s. and now has a lot of money, a part of a billionaire family, a part of a billionaire franchise, and is definitely towards making her own billions, but her family for sure are billionaires. So we could probably move her towards maybe family elite, maybe even over Michelle Obama in terms of finances. Makes more money than Michelle Obama. However, Michelle Obama and President Obama may have more power and can move society and move politics in a way, even though they're not in the presidency anymore, they still have a certain level of power and influence that Kim Kardashian doesn't have. So again, it's not just about money, but also prestige and power and where can you be? And there are certain rooms and dinners that the Obamas can go to that the Kardashians cannot. Then you have this guy who's a janitor. Maybe poor, maybe working class, right? And then this guy, he's a Kennedy. He would be considered a family elite. And there are other family elites as well. I keep saying the Kennedys, that's the one that comes to my mind. But you have the Hiltons, owners of the Hilton hotels. You have the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, all these people in U.S. society who are the Rothschilds. That's more Europe, but Europe, Western Hemisphere, right? Old family money dating back centuries and centuries and centuries. They've been rich for a very long time, couldn't be poor even if they tried. Okay. So to conclude this lecture, prestige is based on the relationships between persons, positions, and symbols, right? So it's not just about how much money you make, but also what positions are you in? Who do you have relationships with? Prestige changes based on the perspective which it is being viewed. So to some people may have higher level of prestige in one place over another. So also prestige can be objective, but it's also subjective as well. Most people rank hierarchy in a few categories, but how they are differentiated and defined varies greatly between people. So a lot of people may look at those categories that we place those people in, upper, lower, upper, middle, we have those categories, but everybody may have different suggestions. Some people may say, oh, that's lower, upper. Oh, no, I think that's upper, upper. People tend to enhance their own position. If I were to ask you, well, what do you think you are? You may say, well, I think I'm middle class, upper middle class. When in actuality, you may actually be working class or lower middle class. People agree more about the extremes than the categories in the middle. So we like to have these extremes of lower, lower, upper, upper. Everybody would say the Kennedys are upper, upper. Everybody would say the people on homeless people are lower, lower. But the ones in the middle are the ones that's difficult. A basketball player, a doctor, a Kim Kardashian, like all these people in the middle are the ones that are like, I don't know. It's hard to decide. The class system is an objective reality that we can only hope to discover. So the more we talk about class, the more we realize how difficult it is to understand and navigate and define. And the more we have to continue to talk it out, uncover it, tease out the nuances to be able to really understand how it influences sociology, our outlook on society, and the way society treats people who are a part of these social classes. So with that being said, that's one of the lectures on social class. That is that. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me during office hours, or email me or inbox me, and I'll be more than happy to assist you. Have a great day, great week, great weekend. See you soon.